Welcome to our 650 webinar, How the New Federal Vaccine Mandate May Affect Your Business. My name is Ryan Parker. I'm the Chief Legal Product Officer at 650. And with me today on our webinar, we have Marie Coolbeth, who is our General Counsel here at 650, and Adrian Jack, who is a Vice President of Legal Product. Marie, Adrian, and I are all attorneys. Marie and Adrian attended excellent law schools and have very relevant practice experience. And we spent some time working on not only this issue, but related issues such as Cal OSHA's ETS and building return to work tool sets. In addition, Marie is the person who sets our return to work policies at 650. And so she has some really great practical experience working through a lot of these issues with our business. So today we're going to talk about the new federal vaccine mandate that was announced by President Biden just a couple of days ago. And we're aware that this is a very, has been a politicized issue. We're going to try to steer away from the politics. We'd ask that you do the same in your questions. By the way, we're going to be answering questions throughout our webinar. And at the end, we have a section set aside for Q&A, but we'd ask you to put all of your questions in the Q&A button so that we can make sure that we answer those. Please don't put them in the chat because it's hard for us to monitor both of those places and to make sure that we've answered questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A and we're happy to answer those. We like to make these webinars as interactive as possible. But as I was saying, this is an issue that has been politicized, and we'll try to steer away from the politics of it and just give you kind of the facts around what you can expect. As many of you may know, there are a lot of details that have yet to be ironed out on what this new requirement will entail. And we're going to start with that, actually. We're going to have Marie Coolbeth jump into what we know about the ETS. The subtext there is also what we don't know about the ETS, which may be more than we actually know. Then we're going to talk just for a minute about potential legal challenges. This is an aspect of these new emergency temporary standards that are going to be issued by federal OSHA that is getting a lot of publicity, and I think a lot of people have questions about. We'll cover what we know there. And then Adrian will talk to us about the impact on large and small businesses. We know that the ETS will cover businesses that have at least 100 employees. We don't know exactly how those will be counted. That'll be covered partially by Marie, but we'll dive into how large businesses and also how smaller businesses could be affected by these ETS. And then we're going to talk just very briefly about implementation. There's a lot we don't know, but there are some things that businesses can do to prepare now to implement these ETS and be prepared when they come out. And then we'll save time for your questions. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Before we dive in, I want to just give you a quick overview of 650. We are the technology subsidiary of the law firm Wilson Sonsini. For those of you that don't know Wilson Sonsini, it's a large law firm that is particularly strong with startups and in the tech sector. And we work with all different practice groups within Wilson Sonsini, including their employment group, to help businesses to create products that help make the law more accessible for businesses. And those include an electronic employee handbook, a return to work tool set that includes health screening and policy generation engines for Cal OSHA COVID prevention programs. We're actually releasing a new tool tomorrow to help companies to create their New York HERO Act program that's now required. And so we're helping companies to make the law more accessible by using technology and smart legal insights to make it easier to produce documents. So if you're interested in learning more about us, we'll put some URLs in the chat that you can follow, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have about that. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Marie, who's going to talk to us about what we know about the forthcoming OSHA emergency temporary standards.
Thanks, Ryan. And I'll just start off by saying it's a combination of what we definitely know, what we maybe know, and what we really don't know right now. So it's an interesting space to be in. But there's a few questions, and I know somebody's already put a question in the chat about who does this even apply to? And I can tell you, if you're on this webinar because you're so confused and so tired of everything changing so quickly. I do feel your pain. I feel like every time I put out a COVID policy for my company, something changes and I have to update the policy that I just put out, which is why I'm really grateful to work at 650, where I have this whole team of people creating policies that I just get to use. But this new emergency temporary standard that we're waiting on has been announced. It hasn't actually been published yet. So there's a lot we don't know, but what we do know, it applies, well, there's a few things that we know. And the first is that outside of private companies generally, healthcare workers at facilities and organizations that receive Medicare or Medicaid reimbursements are going to be required to be vaccinated. So will executive branch federal employees and government contractors. And I'll spend some time on that in a minute because those rules are coming through an executive order, which is different than what we'll spend the most time on today. What we'll spend the most time talking about is this rule that's going to apply to employers with 100 or more employees. And under that rule, which President Biden announced last week, we're going to have a requirement for employees in those at those companies to either be vaccinated or, if they're not vaccinated, be tested weekly. And so one of the first questions is, what do we definitely know? Not much, because we haven't actually seen the text of the regulation yet. But one thing we do know for sure is that employers will be required to give paid time off for their employees to get vaccinated. That was specified in the announcement. So if you're looking for one touch point, it is if you don't currently have a policy in place for your employees to get PTO while they're getting vaccinated, if this rule is going to apply to you, you're going to have to put that in place. And in terms of who is counted in the 100 employee count, that's one of the things that we don't really know yet. We are still waiting for further explanation. From what we've seen so far and from a press briefing that OSHA gave, we think that it will just be employees, not contractors, included in the count. But we'll see. So I did see that was a question in the chat. So not quite sure yet. Most likely it will be employees, not employees plus contractors. But in addition to that, there's also the question of whether federal OSHA even applies to you. So when we get this rule, it's going to come from federal OSHA, and not every state is regulated by this, by the federal OSHA. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So if you look at this slide, and we're going to send this deck to you afterwards so that you can reference it. If you look at the slide, the states that are in light blue are regulated by federal OSHA. They don't have their own state programs. The states that are in the sort of royal blue color, they do have a state OSHA program. And those that are in navy blue have a state OSHA program, but it only applies to government workers. So if you're a private company in one of those navy blue states, you will be regulated by federal OSHA in this new rule that we're having come out. So, however, that doesn't mean that if you're one of the states in royal blue that this rule does not affect you. It still does. The reason being that when the new rule comes out, if your state does not have a rule that's at least as protective as that federal rule, then the federal rule will still apply to you. So at this stage, that probably means the federal rule is going to apply to everyone, at least for a little while, until state OSHAs in those states that have their own catch up and pass their own rules that are at least as protective as this new rule that we're going to see. So that's just a little bit of a tricky part where a lot of people are unfamiliar with how OSHA works in their state. And you may be a company that has multiple jurisdictions. And so again, for now, you're probably going to be governed by federal OSHA in pretty much every case, at least until states catch up with their own regulatory action. And in terms of the number of people that this is going to affect, for those companies that have 100 plus employees, it's estimated that those companies account for about 80 million employees in the United States. And if you add that to the healthcare workers that also are going to have to be vaccinated, which is about 17 million individuals, we're looking at right around 100 million people who will have a vaccine mandate coming through their employment or a requirement or the option to be tested every week. So it's a pretty significant rule that we're going to be looking at. And again, going to that question of who counts in your employee counts, this is the total number of employees in your company to get to 100, not a site specific count. That was specified by OSHA senior advisor Ann Rosenthal during a press briefing this last week. So if you were like, oh, it's okay, none of our work sites have more than 20 individuals, if you add up to 100, it's still going to apply to you. So keep that in mind as we talk about all of these issues today. And now let's talk a little bit about what we're going to see in the rule. So the rule itself is called an emergency temporary standard. And an ETS is a little bit different than a typical rule that comes out through the traditional notice and comment period. So just so you have an idea of what to expect, we do know that it's going to come out in the next few weeks, but no specific date. So we'll see what happens there. There was an ETS from OSHA in June. That's the one that required healthcare workers to get PTO and recovery time for vaccinations, and also put in some requirements for PPE and other things for healthcare workers. So we're expecting that it will probably follow a similar course in terms of the time it takes to get implemented and all of those things as the one that we saw in June. So that says maybe you'll have a runway of 2 to 4 weeks to get things done, but it'll become effective immediately once it is passed, but there will probably be some stopgaps with different time periods for getting different parts of it implemented. What we have heard from the Labor Department is that, again, and I'm going to drive this home a couple of times, you're going to have to provide PTO for employees to receive or recover from the vaccine. However, another clarification that we did get during the press briefing from OSHA is that employers will be able to require employees to use their existing PTO. So if you have a PTO policy already in place, you could have your employees use up that PTO before offering new PTO specifically for the vaccine. At least that's the expectation based on what the OSHA officials told us this last week. So
Marie,
yeah,
we have a question in the Q&A that piggybacks right on this about
great.
If do companies have to supply PTO or time off in addition to PTO, and you've answered that. But the question is, what if the employee is out of PTO or sick time? Do they need to be given additional time off to receive the vaccine?
Yeah, and that's where we expect to see a clarification on this in the ETS itself about procedurally how that will work. But based on what we have seen in other like state-specific versions of ETS, like California has an ETS right now that does some of this, and we are expecting that you'll be required to provide additional PTO and sick time if somebody is out of it, but then goes and gets vaccinated under this mandatory vaccination regime. So yeah, Ryan.
Maria, I'll just jump in as well. You know, a number of states, including California and New York, and a number of localities have passed supplemental paid sick leave laws that cover not only COVID-19 leave, but vaccination specifically. And so I think in a lot of states, we have a question about this. This supplemental paid sick leave would already sort of meet this requirement to provide leave for people to be vaccinated, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So I think, again, like while we don't have the written rule yet, that's something that you should take into account. You may have a state rule that's already providing for this. And so if you're already providing some of that additional leave through your state rule, that could cover what's needed for this. But if somebody is out of all of their leave, you would still need to provide it. So that's a great question, and something that I think we'll see some more procedural guidelines on when we get the actual ETS. So kind of moving forward in terms of what we're going to see coming out with this, the ETS will come from the Secretary of Labor. This is a little bit different because it's not coming from OSHA directly, but that's because it's not going through a traditional notice and comment period. If it's in effect for 6 months and they want to keep it in effect, then it has to go through that process. So if this rule is going to stay in force, we will see traditional notice and comment period, and you'll be able to submit notice and comment if that's something that you want to do. The reason that this was coming through an ETS is that it's been determined that employees are exposed to grave danger from substances or agents determined to be toxic or physically harmful or from new hazards, and the emergency standards are necessary to protect employees from the danger. So this is a little bit of a change. Previously, there had been a decision from OSHA that they wouldn't be issuing a generalized ETS, but with everything changing, with the Delta variant and the increases in hospitalizations and all of that, the situation kind of changed. So this is, an ever evolving situation. So if you're on this webinar, it's because you've already had to issue multiple versions of a COVID policy with new guidelines for your employees. And this is yet another iteration of that is coming down the pipeline. So we've talked about some of the things we definitely know and touched on, thanks to some good questions, some things we're not sure about yet. There's some additional things that we think we're going to see that right now it is a little bit unclear. And the first is one of the very first questions I got when this passed was whether it's applicable to remote employees. We think most likely not. And for that determination, we're sort of looking at the Cal OSHA ETS, which has sort of said, these rules apply except for those employees that are not working with anyone. So if you have a remote employee who's working alone, isn't coming into contact with vendors or clients or anyone like that, then it probably will not apply to them. However, if you do have a remote employee who is coming into contact with others as part of their job, and so say they're remote, but they are meeting with clients in the city where they're your only employee or something like that, then you probably will see this applying to them. Similarly, we're expecting to see it applied to hybrid employees. So those employees that are part remote, part in the office, any in-office time, any time where they're mingling with other individuals as part of their job, is probably going to mean that they're going to have to get vaccinated. And then another thing which we know but don't know, which is why it sort of has a little asterisk on it, is that employers are supposed to most likely going to bear the cost of testing, but be able to put rules in place for how that testing is obtained. And I put a little asterisk on this because we've seen, for example, in California, their ETS has requirements for employers to bear the cost of testing, where an employee has to get tested because they were exposed at work. There's been back and forth discussion just sort of in the space about whether we'll see that requirement under this federal ETS. But one thing we also saw in the announcement from President Biden, where he said that this rule was coming, he did say that they're ramping up free testing services and they're setting aside additional funding for that. So for free testing to come through HHS. And so if that's the case, it may be that an employer may not have to bear the cost of testing because you'll have the ability to route them to free testing services. The concern there is that even with increased free services available, you might have noticed, testing lines are getting really long. I had an employee that sat in one for quite a while earlier this week after one of their children was potentially exposed to COVID. So, if you're having employees that have to get tested every week because they've chosen not to be vaccinated, it could be that the free services are overwhelmed, and for them to actually get tested, they may not be able to go to one of the free sites. So I think we're going to see some really clear policy guidelines in the ETS to help us determine the answer to that question about who bears the testing costs. As I mentioned before, we're expecting to see some phase-in requirements. So, once it's announced, the official ETS, we won't see the text ahead of time because it's not going through the traditional notice and comment period. But once it's announced, we expect that there will be, a fairly short runway to give companies time to get their ducks in a row in terms of becoming compliant. And that's really important because some of the reading I've been doing that's talking about your potential violations is that there's discussion around this being treated as a serious or willful violation if you violate the ETS once it goes into effect. And those have penalties of $13,600 per violation, going up to a total maximum penalty of $136,500. So, these could be fairly significant penalties. And there may also be other potential outcomes that we are not yet anticipating. So fairly important in that sense. We also, though, I should put these two bullet points next to each other, going back to the question of bearing the cost of testing. There was, as I mentioned, a conference call with some of the OSHA representatives, and the acting administrator on September 10th in this call said that employers will have the option of requiring all of their employees to be vaccinated and not offering the or get tested every week option. So while the rule itself is not the rule itself will allow for people to be tested as opposed to getting vaccinated if that's their choice, but an employer could have a more strict rule in place if they want to. So I think that is fairly interesting. I think it does give more control to employers, because we've already seen some employers that have vaccine requirements in place. And that way, for those employers that already have it in place, they wouldn't have to implement a new testing option if they don't already have one. But also, there is the question of costs and risk. And so if you're in an industry where you think there's particular risk and concerns around unvaccinated employees are particularly high, you may not want to offer the testing option as an alternative to the mandatory vaccination option. So there is some flexibility built in there for companies to go more strict than the rule itself requires. And then just in terms of how you're going to collect the information, we're anticipating that we're going to see the same type of flexibility that we see in California. And if you're familiar with the Santa Clara County rules, that county has done a pretty good job of sort of setting up a really clear way for people to self-attest to their vaccination status. And that's sort of the lowest common denominator in terms of collecting information. So, you have the option of collecting an actual card, like taking a picture of it, scanning a card, and keeping those copies. You could also just maintain a record that proof was shown. So you have an employee who's designated as, checking everyone's proof, and they mark that they saw the proof, but you don't actually record the card itself. Self-attestation, where employees just certify that they're vaccinated. And then in Santa Clara County, again, they've sort of gone with this option where, those who refuse to report are treated as unvaccinated. And I think that'll be an interesting space to see what federal OSHA does here. The option of, employees saying, I don't want to tell you. And what do you do in that situation? So, California has kind of accounted for that and said it's allowed, but they have to be treated as if they're unvaccinated. So in the case of federal ETS, if they say the same thing, it would be, employees who won't tell you their status would have to be tested every week as if they were not vaccinated. But if you make the choice to implement a mandatory vaccine policy without the option of testing, then it would potentially be grounds for termination if it's a requirement that they won't comply with, and they don't make a case for an exemption. That is one thing to keep in mind, is with the mandatory vaccination rules, you're still going to have employees who may be eligible for exemptions. And I think that's one of the clarifications that we're going to see coming from ETS, is maybe some guidelines around how to deal with that. But again, religious-based exemptions and medical-based exemptions are really the only two that could potentially qualify. And that's, the situation where, even if you're having a mandatory policy and you're not providing an option for people to be tested every week, maybe that could be what you do for those exemptions cases, is you say, well, we can just have you test every week, even though as a general rule, we're not providing that as an option for employees who just don't want to be vaccinated. If you have an exemption, we could do that for you. So there's things you can do to make this work and to hopefully make it work for everyone. And then, so I've spent most of this time talking about what we're expecting to see for the rule that will affect the most companies, right? Companies that have 100+ employees. But we do have 2 new executive orders that may be applicable to your organization. And the first one that came out is the one regarding federal workers. And so for federal workers and executive agencies, there's a mandatory vaccination program that's being implemented. They do not have a testing alternative. So if you or someone as a federal employee, that mandatory rule for federal employees does not allow the option of just saying, well, I won't be vaccinated, but I'll be tested every week. with, again, the exceptions provided for exemptions, religious and medical exemptions. One thing that we'll probably see a lot more guidance coming from in the near future is the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force. That's one that is hard to say, the Workforce Task Force. The task force is supposed to issue more guidance on how to implement the rule for federal workers. And so that guidance is actually due today. So maybe we'll see some news stories start to pop later in the day when they do issue that guidance. So again, most of you probably are not federal workers, but that is one of the rules that also came down at the same time. And the other rule, which potentially impacts more people on this call, is regarding federal contractors. So there's also an executive order that goes towards federal contractors. And essentially what's going to happen is in those contracts, a new clause is going to be added that will specify that the contractor is going to comply with all of the guidance from that same task force I was just talking about, the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force. And that task force will essentially be creating guidance in line with this vaccine mandate. They're supposed to issue their requirements by September 24th. So if you're a contractor, be looking for that around that deadline. We'll be looking for it too, so we can issue an update. But the agencies will be required to take steps that make sure their contracts are fully lined up and compliant by October 8th. Any contracts entered into after October 15th have to be compliant. But again, sort of the same thing we talked about earlier, there is some runway there. So that, you know, if somebody's already in negotiations with a contractor and it's maybe a little too late in the process to put in that clause, they're kind of providing some runway, and so that things don't grind to a halt in the interim. But those are the main rules that we're looking at. Again, the most important one is going to be the one that impacts companies with 100 or more employees. So that'll, you know, be the majority of the people on the call today. And we're expecting to see further guidance, but we don't know exactly when it'll be issued, but sometime in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Bree. We've had a lot of great questions. I think you answered many of them. They sort of flooded in, and then through your slides, you answered a lot of them. Adrian's answered a couple more. We'll save some also for the Q&A section, but certainly there are a lot of open questions that remain with this ETS. A lot of the press around the ETS has centered on potential legal challenges, and we're going to take just a minute now to talk about potential legal challenges. We won't spend too much time because it's still somewhat speculative, but when President Biden announced the ETS, a number of states, Texas, Florida, Ohio, Arizona, I think at least 13 states came out and said that they were at least threatening to sue over this requirement. And the Attorney General of Arizona, Mark Brnovich, hurried to federal court to file the first suit and quickly had a press conference and was excited to be the first one to file. I don't think it's a coincidence that he is also running actively for a Senate seat. It looked a little bit like a publicity stunt at this point because we really don't know everything that's in the ETS. The other thing that was odd about that suit, just as an aside, and we'll get into some of the bases upon which I think the ETS may be challenged, but he brought an equal protection challenge, claiming that the ETS will require citizens and lawfully working aliens to, it will treat them differently than those who have crossed the border illegally. And he brought an equal protection challenge, which I think is a novel theory, but one that's very unlikely to be successful. But it is interesting. I think we will see a number of more substantive challenges as we move forward that have a stronger legal basis. And these types of suits can be successful. We have recently seen one of these suits. In fact, if we move to the next slide, that will help us here. We've recently seen one of these suits in New York. New York came out with a vaccine requirement for healthcare workers that was recently stayed by a federal judge in New York because it didn't include a clear exemption for people whose religious beliefs would prevent them from being vaccinated. And so these types of suits can be successful. Obviously, the ETS here has a different structure in that it allows for the testing option. And so I think that will be really interesting to see what happens. So as we move forward, let's just talk about what these suits are likely to look like. once the ETS are released, and if we could move on to the next slide, I'll give you kind of a breakdown of the types of challenges we're likely to see. Once the ETS are released, the OSHA Act itself actually allows plaintiffs to file petitions for review directly in the Federal Court of Appeals. So typically federal litigation starts at the district court, then it can be appealed to the circuit court, and then it moves up to the Supreme Court. But the OSHA Act actually allows for review directly in the Court of Appeals. And I think that that's where the most serious challenges will likely be filed. There are two sort of types of challenges that I think we're likely to see. The first is constitutional challenges. This is where the most heat was in the initial press releases from some of the states that said they were going to challenge it. And where we're seeing a lot of the sound bites is that this is beyond Congress's power, and that would be a Commerce Clause challenge. Congress passed the OSHA Act, and essentially delegated its authority to OSHA to take these types of actions. And I think a Commerce Clause challenge, in my view, is probably unlikely to be successful. And it would be interesting to see how that plays out. They have limited this ETS to businesses of at least 100 employees, which I actually think is probably meant to make sure that it's within the Commerce Clause, that businesses of that size likely do interstate commerce. And that may be one of the reasons for that 100-person threshold, is that they want to make sure they're complying with the Commerce Clause. The other one we could see that I think is likely is Equal Protection Clause type of challenge, where we have people with a medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief who are going to feel like they're being treated unfairly under the Equal Protection Clause. That I think the challenge with that type of legal challenge is that we have the testing option. And so I think that the ETS really has thought through how it's going to be able to allow businesses to handle people that have medical conditions or religious beliefs, and that's the testing option. I think where the rubber meets the road there could be on who has to pay for the testing, as long as it's not the employee. For an employee, that could become very expensive to have to pay for tests every week, especially if it's not covered by their insurance. If there's a way where HHS, for example, is providing free testing, the federal government, or there's options for free testing in the community, I think that the type of equal protection challenge that we could see probably faces an uphill battle. I think the second type of challenge is, in my view, a more interesting one, and that's the statutory challenge. And we had Marie talk earlier about how OSHA can promulgate rules in essentially two different ways. There's a lengthy normal process that they go through, where there's notice and comment, and they go through all of the different steps for creating a government rule. And then there's the ETS process, which bypasses all of those normal steps and allows them to put a rule into place much more quickly. But because of that bypass, there is stringent review of those types of rules, and that's what we've seen in the past. And in order to put an emergency temporary standard, an ETS, in place, Cal OSHA has to identify a grave danger to employees and then show that the ETS are necessary to protect employees from the danger. And those are, I think, the two areas where we will probably see the most serious legal challenges here to the ETS. And I think there will be questions about why the ETS that was issued earlier, that only applied to healthcare workers, was not applied more broadly if there is a grave danger. I think there'll be questions about the timing of the ETS as we reach a point where many people in the United States have been vaccinated, although many remain unvaccinated. And I think there will be some interesting legal issues that are litigated around these two bases, that these two boxes that OSHA needs to be able to check: the grave danger and the necessary to protect employees. I want to just go to the next slide. It's interesting. The ETS, OSHA does not use ETS very often. In fact, from some of the research that I did, it looks like they've issued 9 ETS, and that's before the most recent. But historically, they had issued 9 ETS. 6 of them had been challenged in court, and 5 of those challenges were successful. The most recently being an asbestos-based ETS in 1983. And when I see successful, that's either that it was struck down or partially struck down. And so There have been successful challenges, although you'll notice that we haven't had one of these challenges for a very long time. That we're looking at almost a 40-year period here without a challenge. And so this is interesting. I do think that when you really dig down into whether the COVID-19 presents a grave danger, I think there's a strong argument there, despite some of the timing issues and the necessity of a vaccine to confront that. There'll be strong arguments, I think, on both sides. And so I think that these are the type of legal issues that you're likely to see. They'll start most likely in the Court of Appeals. I think that you'll see a lot of cases. I think you'll see states bring cases like we've already seen in Arizona. I think you'll see private employers bring cases. I think you'll see private employers and states try to bring cases in states where they will find more favorable courts of appeals. And so I think you could have, for example, the Fifth Circuit as a circuit where you're likely to get a lot of these challenges. But I think you'll see challenges probably in many circuits across the country. I think the cases could ultimately reach the Supreme Court. That's where decisions from the Court of Appeals are appealed to. A big question is whether there will be enforcement of these ETS during these legal challenges. And I think that remains to be seen. And I think it'll be interesting. I think it's possible that the ETS could be stayed during a legal challenge. At the end of the day, I think businesses would be wise to prepare to comply with the ETS. I think if I were to have to bet, and there's a lot of uncertainty, we don't know exactly what's in the ETS. So it's hard to say whether they'll be upheld at this point. But I think that COVID has presented a unique challenge for our country and specifically for businesses. And with the number of casualties that we've had from COVID-19 and the spread of the Delta variant, I think there's a good chance that this could be upheld. That being said, it's unclear and we really don't know. But I think that businesses would be smart to be thinking about how they can prepare to comply with the ETS moving forward, because although Marie talked about a ramp up period, I think this is something that could be passed, challenged, determined pretty quickly, and the businesses would be well positioned if they start to prepare early. With that, we'll turn the time over to Adrian to talk about how the ETS could affect large and small businesses. Adrian, I think we still got you on mute there.
Thanks, Ryan. As both Ryan and Marie indicated, we still don't know exactly what's in the ETS yet. And so a lot of this depends on what's in the final ETS standards that are issued, but there are so many issues that companies can be thinking about now about how they plan to address those and have a plan in place so that when the ETS are issued, they're ready to implement and comply with it in a much quicker time frame. So when I say big businesses, we're referring to businesses with 100 or more employees to which the federal ETS are expected to apply. And as Marie indicated, it's not totally clear on exactly how that 100 employee headcount will be determined. But when we refer to big businesses, that's what we're referring to. And on its face, the ETS seem like it applies only to vaccinations and testing. But as companies dig into those issues and plan to comply, they'll quickly realize the implications are so much broader. It applies to many different areas and impacts much more than just a vaccine or test mandate. One of the biggest issues I think that large companies in several states will have to grapple with is how to comply with the different standards. As Marie indicated, the federal standard only applies to about half of the states. So that standard that we expect to be issued quickly will apply in half of the states, but the other 21 states have their own state regulatory scheme. And so they will be issuing different standards. And while the state standards have to be at least as protective as the federal ETS, they could be much more strict and they could differ in several different ways. So for example, while the federal ETS requires employees to be vaccinated or tested weekly, a state could easily require that employees be tested daily or biweekly to enter the workplace. So companies should be prepared to handle these different standards that might be issued. So one standard might be issued in one state where a more strict standard applies in a different state. And so there are several different ways to approach this. One is that the company can just comply with the most strict standard. So if there's employees in several states and one of those states says that you have to be tested every day, the company could comply with that standard in all of its locations. A different approach, depending on how strict the standards are and where the bulk of the employees are located, is to have different standards for different states. And that can be a headache to enforce and comply with, but it really, companies should be thinking about, okay, where are employees located? Are we going to be subject to the federal ETS, or will there be a state standard that's going to come out? And what are we going to do if they differ? So that's something that companies can be thinking about now, even though we're not sure exactly what's going to be in the ETS or in any of the state ETS that are issued. So the second thing is companies need to be thinking about a written policy. We're not sure if the federal ETS will require this, but we do know that Cal OSHA, which has kind of been the most robust ETS that we've seen to date, does require employers have a written plan, and that written plan has to have certain requirements about how the company is protecting employees from COVID-19, information they're providing to employees, and various other things. But we're anticipating that maybe the federal ETS will require a written plan, but also the state requirements could have a written plan. But regardless of what the federal or state requirements are, we think it's just a best practice to have a written plan about how the company is complying with these regulations that will come out. There will likely be a lot of employee questions, a lot of issues that the company needs to think through, and it's really just a best practice to have a plan in place that addresses all of these things about the company's procedures and protocols, potential issues, and that way, if there are questions down the road, the company has a clear communication with employees about how they're complying, and heaven forbid they get a Cal OSHA investigation, that they can have that written document as proof of this is what we're doing to comply with the ETS, which is also helpful in any kind of OSHA investigation. So, and then third, companies need to consider how they're going to verify vaccination and testing status. And Marie talked about this, so I won't go into depth about this, but there are several different ways to comply with this requirement to verify that an employee is vaccinated. And based on what we've seen from Cal OSHA, which has kind of been the leader so far in this space, they don't require a specific way to verify that employees are vaccinated. So companies should think about how they want to approach this. Do they want to require employees provide proof of their vaccination status? And if so, do they want to retain that record or not retain a copy of that record? Do they want to have employees self-attest that they're vaccinated? And then also, companies will need to comply with proof of testing status, which is different from their vaccination status. Vaccination status is typically a one-time event. Employees provide it, and then the company has that information, and they don't need any ongoing information from the employee. Whereas the logistics of obtaining testing information are very open and ongoing. So the company is collecting that information much more frequently. And so the company could consider, maybe they'll have one standard for vaccination status. Maybe they do want proof of vaccination status, but for testing status that has to be performed weekly, maybe they don't want a proof of every weekly test result. They just want employees to self-attest to that testing result. So companies need to think about how they're going to collect proof of vaccination and testing status, whether those standards will be different, and then which immediately follows on to that, how are employees going to retain those vaccination and testing status files? The vaccination and testing status of employees, that's confidential medical information that has to be retained separately from an employee's personnel file. And companies should consider who would have access to the vaccination and testing information of employees. Who is it necessary and relevant to have access to? And keep that access as limited as possible, because this information is so sensitive and confidential. So companies need to think about, how are we going to collect this information, whether that's through a written survey, an intranet, an email response, a Word document. I mean, there's so many different ways that companies could collect this information from employees. And then once that information is obtained, how is the company going to store it securely and privately in compliance with regulations? And additionally, we don't know how long that information about vaccine status and testing information has to be maintained. In California, for example, and we refer to Cal OSHA so much because they are really kind of the market leader in these COVID ETS standards, and we expect that federal OSHA will look to these standards partially in formulating their own standards. So we kind of look to Cal OSHA to see what we might expect from the ETS, though it's not certain, and it could certainly differ from what is happening in California. But in California, for example, Cal OSHA has indicated that the medical record, the vaccine status or testing information needs to be maintained by the company for the length of time necessary to establish compliance with the regulation, including any Cal OSHA investigation or appeal of citation. They did indicate, in an effort to encourage companies to collect this information, that this medical information is not subject to the 30-year retention period of other medical records, which is probably not very reassuring to companies that we know it's less than 30 years. That's not particularly helpful, but we just don't know how long companies are going to need to retain this information. So companies can think about, where can we store this securely for, it could be potentially a long period of time. And then, as Marie indicated, oh, sorry, Marie, go ahead, jump in.
I just had one more thought. I would say we do know you have to keep it for at least a year, because whatever OSHA decides, ADA requires you to keep it for at least that long. So don't plan to be deleting these after 6 months if the ETS ends in 6 months.
That's right. Thank you, Marie. Yeah, so I mean, between 1 and 30 years, but that's potentially a very long period of time that companies could have to retain this information. So as companies implement the ETS, we know that it doesn't apply to employees who work exclusively remotely, only employees who enter the workplace. But that requires companies to track who is entering in the workplace. They need to know where employees are working from, to know which standard will apply to that employee, because the state where the employee is working is the OSHA standard that will apply to that employee, and then track who is entering the workplace. And companies should have a procedure in place to track this, and then to not only track who's entering, but to verify, okay, that person that entered the workplace, have they reported their vaccination status, or have they provided a negative test result? And also what to do if somebody enters the workplace and has not provided that information. The company should, hopefully that doesn't happen, but the company should know in advance, how are we going to handle this situation if somebody enters a workplace without complying with the ETS? So it's clear in advance and can be handled in a professional manner. And in some states, we're seeing that, like, for example, in California, Cal OSHA requires that companies provide employees with certain information. In California, companies have to provide their employees information about where employees can be tested for COVID-19, whether that's through a local health department, a hospital, a community testing center. Companies in California are required to provide that information to their employees. So we don't know if the federal ETS will have that same standard, but companies should be thinking about, okay, there will possibly be some communication requirements in the ETS that we're anticipating. How are we going to communicate that? Which goes back to the written plan concept. It's very helpful and advantageous in several different ways to have a written plan that they can distribute to employees that communicates this information that may or may not be required by the ETS, but is probably very helpful to employees and appreciated in answering a lot of employee questions. Also, as Marie mentioned, companies will be required to provide paid time off for vaccination and to recover from the side effects of vaccination. That has been indicated already that we will expect that in the ETS. However, we have not heard yet whether that will be required for companies to provide paid time off for employees to be tested. So some states like California, Massachusetts, and New York already required private paid time off for COVID-related events such as vaccination. So in those states, I know we've talked about this, that wouldn't be a different requirement. Some states are already requiring that, and companies may already have that in place. But in the vast majority of other states, that's not required. So companies need to think about, how are they going to communicate this paid time off to employees? How are they going to track that paid time off? Are employees going to report it? And then how will that be tracked in the company's payroll system and paid time off recording? Will it be additional paid time off, or is the company requiring employees to use their already accrued paid time off to be vaccinated and recover? So there are a lot of different nuances here that companies can be thinking about. Even though we don't have the ETS yet, the companies can make a lot of progress in thinking about these issues before we get the ETS issued. And then also, companies, we don't expect that companies will be required to pay for the cost of testing for employees who opt to be tested weekly for COVID-19. But we don't know yet what that requirement will be. And some companies may desire to provide that testing free to employees because of the expense or the burden that it puts on their employees. So companies could think about, if this is not required for us to pay for, is this something we'd like to provide free to our employees? And if companies do desire to pay for the cost of testing, how are we going to administrate this benefit? For example, are we going to provide it as a reimbursement where employees have to show us the cost and then we'll pay them, we'll reimburse them for it? Or is it a stipend that's given to employees and employees can determine how that is used? And additionally, we know that this path out of the pandemic regulations that are coming out, that President Biden indicated that he expects to provide a lot more at-home tests and invest in a lot more at-home and rapid testing. And so do companies want to provide that testing at-home test to employees? I mean, these are all different options that companies have, though they might not be required by the ETS. Companies can think about, do we want to provide free testing kits, or do we want to pay for testing even if it's not required? And how are we going to distribute the testing kits? I mean, there are a lot of logistical issues that need to be thought through if the company decides to provide additional benefits that may or may not be required by the ETS. Similarly, companies might want to revisit their mask mandates. They might have mask mandates that reflect an unvaccinated workforce, and they may or may not decide to revisit those. The CDC has kind of initially indicated that masks were not required indoors for vaccinated people, but has gone back to the standard that masks should be worn indoors even if vaccinated. So companies should think about their mask mandate rules and how they want to approach that in light of the new ETS. Additionally, companies should think about how they want to deal with employees who refuse to get vaccinated or tested. It's foreseeable that employees could refuse to do either of those options. And companies should have a plan in place to how they're going to communicate with that employee, what's going to be the end result of working with that employee if they're refusing to be vaccinated or comply with the mask mandate. Which goes back to the point of what to do if somebody who's neither of those enters the workplace. Companies should be prepared to handle that. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but in the event that that does happen, companies should be prepared to handle it. And then we already know that there's a labor shortage, and we're curious whether this ETS will impact the labor shortage. One study from the Society for Human Resource Management indicated that 20% of employed Americans say they won't get vaccinated even if they have to lose their job. So we don't know whether those employees would be comfortable with being tested weekly or what the result will be. So companies should think about, what does this mean for our workforce? How will they handle this ETS? How can we work with them to ensure compliance with it? And then finally, companies will need to continually monitor changes to the ETS. I know it hasn't been issued yet, so keeping up with it sounds so far down the road, but companies need to think about, how are we going to stay updated with this? So right now, the CDC has defined fully vaccinated as 2 doses of the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine or 1 dose of J&J. But we don't know if down the road fully vaccinated will mean you have to have an annual booster for that vaccination. So companies need to think about, how are we going to continue to ensure compliance with this evolving ETS? And then well, let's go to the next slide. And I want to just quickly address, even if you think, oh, this doesn't apply to my company because we don't have 100 employees that enter the workplace, I would consider companies to think again. I think this will have a lot of implications, even for small companies that might not meet that 100 employee threshold. Can we jump to the next slide? So for example, and feel free to refer to this chart in the slides, but a lot of companies, the majority of companies are small employers with 1 to 4 employees. Even though the majority of the workforce works for large employers, just keep in mind, there are so many businesses with 1 to 4 employees and that are below the 100 employee threshold that should still be aware of this ETS and consider how it affects them. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. And as I mentioned, the federal ETS only applies to 100 or more employees, but that standard could be much lower in other states. So in California, for example, the standard is 2 employees. It's really 1 employee who enters the workplace and interacts with others. So by default, 2 employees would probably meet that standard. So even if you think, oh, we're good, we don't have 100 employees, you need to ask, are we subject to the federal ETS, or will we have a state OSHA plan that will come out? And could that threshold for employees be much lower than 100? So companies in California have already been dealing with this, even small companies that may have much fewer than 100 employees. And as with all companies, even even small companies, it is so beneficial to have a written policy of how is this company handling the response to COVID-19, to vaccinations and testing. Even if they're not subject to the ETS, employees are asking these questions. Companies want to have a uniform policy that they're applying consistently to all employees. And so that's something we encourage all companies to think about, regardless of size, regardless of ETS application. And then similarly, small companies that may not be subject to the ETS may work with bigger companies that are subject. So they need to consider, how does this affect our employees who may be working with bigger companies or going into the workplaces of other companies? Should we follow that same standard in order to facilitate our business? So that's another layer that companies need to think about. And then also, as this federal mandate of this vaccine or test mandate has been rolled out, smaller companies that may have been reluctant in the past to issue a similar policy may feel more comfortable doing so, knowing that this will apply to the vast majority of companies, and it kind of levels the playing field in some ways, or increases the comfort of companies being able to have this standard without fearing that, oh, company or employees might just go to the other company just down the street, but they're also going to have to comply with that same standard. So in conclusion, this has a lot of implications for big companies that they should already be thinking about now. And even if your company doesn't have 100 employees, you should still really consider the implications of the new ETS that we're expecting.
Thanks, Adrian. I think that a lot of great points in there. One that really jumps out at me is the possibility that states that have their own OSHA approved plan might adopt the same standards, but lower the employee threshold. And that's something I would not be at all surprised to see in states like California, where they're already applying ETS to essentially every employer. And so I think will be an interesting issue to watch as states apply these plans. They have to provide a plan that's at least as restrictive. I don't see them applying necessarily. I would be surprised at more tests, upping the test requirement, but I would be not surprised at all to see them lower the employee number. I think that would be a really interesting one. As we kind of wrap things up, we wanted to just talk about implementation. For a company, what are the takeaways? How can a company prepare for the ETS now? And I think the first is to think through the relevant issues. And I would say the big one for companies to think through is, if they do not already have a vaccination policy, how are they going to collect vaccination information? Are they going to require proof? Are they going to require a copy of the proof? Is a self-attestation going to be enough? How are they going to store that information? Those are things that companies should be thinking through now, because they're complicated and they're issues that deserve, I think, a fair amount of thought that a company doesn't want to rush into. The other is that companies should prepare to create a strong policy foundation. And Adrian touched on this, but these are not the types of decisions that you want to sort of make ad hoc. I think they're decisions where you want to be prepared to issue a policy or a plan to your employees. And this goes to the next bullet point, which is to create a clear communication channel. I think that employees are already having questions. This new federal vaccine, and we called it a mandate. It's interesting. Even that term has been subject to debate, but this new requirement is one that a lot of people are wondering about. They have questions. And so I think clear communication channels now and in the future are going to be crucial as companies look to prepare themselves to implement these ETS. We have had a ton of questions. I think we've had almost 30 questions come in, but we've tried to answer all of them in the chat, and we've hit the 2-hour mark. So I think we're going to wrap things up here, but I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had a big crowd with a lot of interesting questions. I want to thank Marie and Adrian for their preparation and the excellent presentation. And I hope that each of you will join us for future 650 webinars. Again, if you're interested in our products that are helping businesses return to work safely, and that would be our return to work tool set that includes an engine for creating a return to work policy and an assessment to help you look at all the different issues. We have a Cal OSHA compliance module. And as I mentioned, we're coming out tomorrow as part of our return to work tool set with a document generation engine that will help companies to create the plan they need to comply with New York's HERO Act. So if you're interested in any of those return to work solutions, or our employee handbook, or our privacy solutions, which include products that help companies with the CCPA in California, the GDPR in Europe, the PIPL, the new privacy law in China, and we're currently working on a product for Virginia's new privacy law. So if you're interested in any of those solutions, feel free to visit us at 650.com. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, and have a great day.